Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session of CME Palooza Fall. I am Scott Kober, the co-producer of CME Palooza, and I'd like to welcome you to this session entitled Preparing for Tomorrow's Learners Today. Our moderator for this session is Elise Kuklinski, the General Manager of Clinical Care Options, and so I thank her and I thank everyone else on this panel for joining us. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Certainly, I would like to thank all of our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Genentech and Platform Q Health, our silver sponsors, CTI Meeting Technology and Educational Measures, iMedX, MedPage Today, and Paradigm Medical Communications, and finally our bronze sponsors, ASIM, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, Highmark CE, PVI, Real CME, Dissel Editorial, and Vindigo Medical Education. So there are three ways to ask questions during this and all of our sessions. You can use the MedPage Today text line to send in a question to 267-666-0CME. You can also click on the Google Plus Q&A link located at the bottom of each video. You will need to have a Google account to ask a question. You can also tweet your questions to us using the hashtag CMEPalooza hashtag. And so we'll be keeping an eye on questions that come in during today's session and route them accordingly. And so finally, we have a speaker disclosure slide just to make sure you know that the opinions expressed during this session are our own and do not represent an endorsement of an employer, parent company, or any of our affiliates. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Elise to introduce the rest of the panel and kick off this session.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. We all actually represent a pretty diverse group of individuals representing different parts of our community and industry, so I think we'll have a great discussion, and I look forward to hearing from them and from all of you. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Patrick Alguire. Dr. Alguire is Senior Vice President of Medical Education, excuse me, at the American College of Physicians. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you.
Next, I'll introduce Kim Huggins. Kim is Senior Principal at CLG Consulting and a recognized thought leader on generational differences in healthcare. If you attended the CBI conference in Philadelphia last week, you'll recognize Kim. She was a featured keynoter there. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. And finally, I'd like to introduce Sophie Peloquin. Sophie is a lead researcher in the Performance Improvement Division at AXDev. Welcome, Sophie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Hi, everyone.
So as a means of introducing our topic today and grounding our presentation, I thought I would go ahead and begin with some insights that we at CCO gleaned from a recent survey and study we conducted, specifically looking at generational shifts in the physician workforce and what those implications might be for CME. Our findings are detailed and they're much more nuanced than I'll present today. Again, I just want to give you an overview and introduce the topic. You can download the full white paper on the CME Palooza homepage, or feel free to email me or visit the CCO website and download it. But again, there's some interesting findings here that I think can serve as a springboard for our discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and present an overview. First, actually, let me back up and say it's probably virtually impossible to read a journal, a newspaper, or even watch the news without hearing reference or discussion of millennials. I live in Boston, and just a couple weeks ago in the Boston Globe, there was actually the Sunday Globe, there was an article about how Harvard was revamping their graduate medical education in recognition of the fact that there was an influx of millennials, this new generation, and they recognized that they needed to make some changes to their core curriculum and to how it's being delivered in response to those generational shifts. So it's, again, virtually impossible not to hear the word millennials, and I'm sure if I did marketing full-time, I'd be really focused on millennials and their impact and what they mean for all of us in the coming years. But very briefly, millennials are loosely defined as individuals born between 1981 and 2000, which seems unbelievable to me, but millennials will comprise the majority of the healthcare workforce by 2025. So this is the generation that's really up and coming. They're the folks that are graduating now from health professionals programs, and they're folks we're probably all going to be seeing as our physicians and clinicians in the next few years. At CCO, we recently conducted a survey. We were looking to actually inform our product evolution and development. And we developed a survey that was specifically designed to evaluate age-based trends and educational preferences. And we wanted to look specifically at technology adoption. And again, this was a survey conducted specifically of CCO member learners. And we do a lot of online educational programming at CCO, so that's an inherent bias. These were folks that are very accustomed to working with us and seeing us and interacting with us online. We conducted this survey in the first quarter of this year, and we did receive responses and participation from a little over 400 physicians. One of the key findings, perhaps surprising, perhaps not, but we did find an inverse relationship between physician age and their self-reported comfort level with technology. And we specifically asked about their comfort in using technology to participate in CME activities. And you can see a snapshot of those findings here. Again, I'm not sure whether or not you would find that particularly surprising, but again, inverse relationship between age and reported comfort level with certain technologies. What we found, though, was that although people may be reporting that they're less comfortable using technology, they're still using technology to engage and participate in activities. Specifically among the millennial physicians who participated in our survey, we identified some preferences. We noted a preference for concise, easily retrievable formats, specifically those that could be used at point of care. That was a consistent finding across all of physician age groups who participated in the study, but it was specifically and especially notable among millennial physicians. Our millennial physician survey respondents did tell us they were less likely to attend live meetings, both on a national and a regional local scale. They were, interestingly enough, less motivated by CME credit offering, and they had a higher appreciation, they valued more a fun factor in CME activities, or the notion of edutainment, that CME should somehow be educational and entertaining at the same time. An overwhelming trend, and this has been cited in other studies and reported elsewhere, but the use of smartphones and mobile technology is a huge driver here. And 70% of our youngest physicians reported using a smartphone participate in CME activities. And that was in marked contrast to our oldest cohort of physician survey respondents, only a quarter of whom really reported that they were using mobile devices to access CME. This is a slide courtesy of my colleague Andrew Bowser. This is not something that we looked at specifically in our survey, but I think it's an important trend in the context of generational preferences. So I brought it in here. The notion of healthcare providers and physicians specifically using social media is one that's been raised a lot in the lay and professional media and press. And what we see is that nearly 3/4 of today's physicians are using social media. And it's a little distorted on the slide, I apologize, but overwhelmingly these are the physicians in our younger age bracket, those in their 20s and early 30s. The vast majority, over 90% of whom, are using social media. So what are our implications for CME, not just for how we design and administer CME activities, but how we plan them, how we market them, how we engage with our faculty and our learners? Some of the conclusions we drew based on our survey and white paper was that formats and technology very certainly, undoubtedly affect the appeal and the adoption and the perceived utility of the CME activities that we're presenting. It's very, very clear that millennial physicians demand the availability of activities and programs via smartphones and tablets. And one of the questions we have is whether these findings persist over time. So are these findings that we expect will persist and increase as this generation sort of makes its influx and represents a larger group of the practicing clinicians out there? Or are these trends? Are these trends because they're trends nationwide and trends globally? People are using social media more in general, and is that a trickle-down effect that we're seeing among healthcare providers, or is this something that's really here to stay? So with that, I want to break from our formal presentation, invite our participants via Google to ask questions at any point in time via the three ways that Scott described. But I would like to open it up and really delve into some of our discussion with our panel here. Again, we represent a pretty diverse spectrum of participants in the CME community. And I want to just stand back and again springboard from the CCO survey findings that I presented. Patrick, let's start with you and your work at ACP. Can you tell us what you specifically have observed with respect to generational differences, specifically with the way physicians are learning, interacting, and engaging?
Well, this is a very complex question for us. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean by that. We recently did a survey of our members who subscribe to the Annals of Internal Medicine. This would be our medical literature journal for internal medicine. The reason is that the journal is available online. It's available on with a responsive design. One can access it with a cell phone or a tablet. And there's, in addition to that, there's an Annals app that people can use. Now, the membership of the American College of Physicians is all the way from medical students to physicians that are retirement age. So we sent out a survey. Should we get rid of the Annals of Internal Medicine print version and go only with the online version that you can access in these variety of different ways? The answer was overwhelmingly no. Approximately 95% of the respondents said keep the print journal, and there was no difference between our youngest physicians and our oldest physicians. Another interesting thing happened is we have a program that we call our Medical Knowledge Self-Assessment Program. Very big program. It's published every 3 years. It's in a print form only. It's in a digital form only. And one can buy the print and digital form. And the subscribers of this product range from individuals that are residents in internal medicine to older physicians. And there were accounting for about 64% of the purchases. On the other hand, we have found that young physicians, particularly when preparing for high-stakes examinations, actually don't prefer text. They like to study multiple choice questions. So this is your little bit of information that can be presented quickly. It can be devoured in 1 to 2 minutes. You can stop there or you go on. So we're really seeing quite a mixed picture at the ACP.
Thank you. Kim, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things that he just mentioned, I would definitely say, I think there is a mix, and I think the reason we're still seeing the mix is that there's still a generational mix in terms of, you know, that the audiences that are participating in the programs. But over the next few years, as more and more millennials, you know, make up a higher percentage of the workforce, I think, you know, we're really going to start to see a significant shift in, you know, demand in terms of changing, you know, our strategies around the way information is being presented and the way, you know, people are accessing the information itself.
Sophie, before we move on to you, because I do want to hear your perspectives as well, from the AXTA perspective and perhaps even from an international vantage point. Patrick, can we go back to the survey findings that you were discussing? And one thing that occurs to me was that very often when you ask people, when you provide a choice, people or respondents will tell you that they always want the choice. So when you provide people with the choice between print and digital, or accessing something print or accessing it online. And again, this isn't grounded in data. This is my perception. My perception is that many people are going to tell you that they always want the choice. Don't get rid of the print. We love the journal. There's that one time I want to be able to dash and go and read the journal when I'm on a plane, when I don't have web access. How do your survey findings correlate with what you're actually seeing with respect to how people are accessing the annals?
The difficulty is we certainly know how many people are accessing it digitally.
Right.
But what we can't tell you is that how many people are actually using the print product. Once the print product is in their hand, we have no way of recording its use, whether or not they open it up. But in an indirect way of answering your question, if we look at the medical knowledge self-assessment program, we found that, and this is a purchase decision, that 2/3 of our subscribers, and again, no age difference in this decision, but 2/3 pick the print and the digital product, even though it's the most expensive option that they can pick. So, that tells me something as well.
Absolutely. Sophie, how about you? What are you seeing or noticing with respect to generational differences in the way people are using information?
Well, just to provide background for those who do not know HacksDev, we're an international organization conducting research, behavioral and educational research in the field of healthcare. So we've been conducting for needs assessment to look at the issues and challenges across different therapeutic areas in healthcare, as well as program evaluation down the road, also to see how CME and CPD and PI can affect in terms of effectiveness and impact on the performance of healthcare providers. So what we've been observing, we've done a study, and this is already back to 2010 with the University of Virginia with the team of Jan Balmer. And in this study, as I said, 5 years ago already, we could see that the millennials had different preferences compared to the boomer generation, for example. What our study found at that time was that there was a strong preferences for peer-to-peer interactive formats of education among the millennials, small group activities, and mentoring program or clinical preceptorship programs. So there is a greater interest in younger generation also for education that's competency-based, which we don't see as much in the older generation of learners. So in that study specifically, the younger physicians reported that they self-identify as having more challenges related to communication or interacting, collaborating interprofessionally, and that so they're looking more for those types of educational activities that their older counterpart maybe. So that's interesting. There was also another finding that's interesting in terms of formats of learning is that the younger physicians, the millennials generation, they were more interested in doing e-learning that was synchronous versus asynchronous e-learning. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was interesting as I was reviewing the findings this week, and I wanted to look into more recent data. So went back to a study that was conducted recently. It's not published, but what we found, and this was an international study, is that the younger generation of specialists, this was a study with specialists, that had about 5 to 10 years of experience experts in the field had a tendency to be more interested in doing asynchronous e-learning than synchronous one. So compared to the older generation. So again, there seems to be, it's evolving. 5 years ago compared to today, we find slightly different data. I think this is something that will continue to evolve as well in terms of preferences for format and preferences for length and so on.
Okay. There's a question that just came in, and I don't know if you guys want to address this now or perhaps you'll get to it later, but here's the question. So how can information on generational differences be applied to the educational design and measurement process? Is it possible to incorporate multiple methods that are age-specific, or is it better to seek broad appeal across all learners?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That actually is much of the crux of what we outlined today in preparing to present, and I think it is what we really need to discuss. What are the implications of generational differences in the design, planning, and implementation of CME specifically? And I think another aspect of that, the participant who submitted this question, thank you, I think was getting at this, but one of the things we can also consider is, should we be considering these generational differences? How do we go about doing this? Are we imparting some sort of age bias into our activities? Is this something we really should be designing for? We're designing programs ostensibly that reduce clinician gaps in knowledge, competence, and performance. To what extent do generational differences, or does age, really affect that? So let's go ahead and jump into that. Kim, do you have any initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you really have to obviously know your audience, right? And so as we look at the demographics from a generational perspective right now, there's still a mix. And I think, so it's really about, knowing your audience and starting to integrate some of those options where you can. And I think, as we see more and more millennials enter into the workforce and enter into these programs, then, the shift is probably going to be more heavily weighted towards what millennials really want. But I think for right now, it's, looking at your data, understanding the demographics of your audience, and starting to, where you can, offer some options. Because really all of the generations are looking for, to get some value out of the program, and they're looking for some flexibility in terms of their learning styles and preferences. And so I think you really have to look at it in terms of accommodating all generations right now, but with, a lens of over the next only few years, really, as more and more millennials enter, then you're going to want to start getting a little bit more creative with how you appeal to their learning needs and preferences.
Thank you. Patrick, at the ACP, how are you beginning to address this?
Well, I agree with what Kim said, and we're trying to follow that particular strategy. Whenever we can, we like to offer more options for the same content, and we're beginning to track the uptake of those various educational options and who's using them. Of course, you can't do this for every educational offering that you have within an organization because there's a financial note associated with it. But this is what we're trying to do. And I agree with you have to know who your audience is, and to a certain degree, the program that you are working with, because I think there may be different strategies for a live meeting versus meetings that are recorded and can be accessed asynchronously. So just to summarize, we're experimenting with various options when we can and trying to track the uptake of those options.
Thank you. It does raise an interesting point. We tend to focus on format and activity delivery when we talk about generational differences, and how do we format an activity appropriately? How do we design an appropriate length or an appropriate type of educational content? But the questioner actually picked up on this in their question. There are implications for how we're generating an audience, how we're just seeking to engage with physicians and clinicians globally to get them to participate in our activities, as well as to how we're seeking their input and their engagement on things like program evaluation or outcome studies. Sophie, are you, from an outcomes and evaluation perspective, because I know this is something that AxDev works on consistently and very deeply, how are things like your performance improvement initiatives or your outcome studies globally affected by some of these trends?
This is an interesting question, and actually when I was looking at the slide you presented on social media, I was reflecting on the fact that do we need to adapt to this trend? So one thing we've seen in doing program evaluation for sure is that we need to rethink the way that we are reaching out to potential participants in CME activities, and the way we're reaching out also when we want to assess, to look at outcomes. We need to think about social media because sending email invitation or the old paper-based, invitation doesn't work anymore as much. People are receiving a large quantity of spam and emails, and we've noticed that it's really hard to get their attention through those means. So yes, we have to rethink how we're going to be reaching out to potential participants, and to make sure that this reach them, this is meaningful to them, and also in order to be able to keep the number of participants high. How we'll do it? Should we use social media? This I don't really have the answers to that, but I really think that we need to start thinking about using the new technologies when we deploy outcomes assessment, or even when we deploy CME activities.
Thank you.
The other point I just was going to make on this topic of, should you start this blended learning approach now, is that, the millennial generation is very quick to form an opinion and to discount things that they don't feel are of value to them. So I think for this audience, it's particularly critical to start to get them interested and engage and make a connection with them early on, if you want them to continue to participate, as they become larger in numbers in the future. Because if they, don't feel like the program's adding value, or they don't see that there's flexibility in terms of meeting their learning needs, and if they don't feel like there's a connection, for them, then it's going to be really difficult to get them, interested and retain them as program participants in the future.
That's a very interesting point. How do you, and I'm interested, I know this is something we talk about a lot at CCO, or we're designing and implementing specific activities, but there's always the question of faculty. So we can all be on board with a particular delivery activity or format, or with the delivery of something or the use of a particular technology. What happens when faculty aren't? Clearly, there's always new faculty. That's an answer. But sometimes we need to reconcile that what millennial physicians, what new clinicians want, or the way they want to learn, doesn't mesh with the thought leaders in the field, and with the people who are perhaps best suited to educate on a particular topic. So how do we reconcile that? How do we move the needle with our faculty as we see that needle being moved by our learners themselves?
So, Elise, it's an interesting question, and I'll have to say at this point in time at ACP, we've not come across any area of real difficulty. If we have an unusual way that we would like to deliver information, of course we'll speak with the faculty and see if they're compatible, if that's compatible with their teaching style. And it's really hard for me to recall anyone who said to us, no, I prefer not to do it that way. I prefer to do it most of the faculty seem to be more effective leaders. Now, having said that, I'm sure probably tomorrow I'll come across someone who will absolutely refuse to change their teaching style. But I think if that did happen, we would just simply say, thank you very much. This format probably isn't going to meet your teaching methodology style very well, and we would just go find someone else. So at today, I can say this has not been an issue for us.
Mm-hmm. I know from my personal experience where I've encountered the most difficulty is in a live meeting setting, often in a very live meeting setting where the easiest, perhaps easiest sort of default option is to ask a faculty member to deliver a standard lecture. They've done this 100,000 times. They have their material prepared. They're practiced in delivering in this format. It's something they're very, very comfortable with, and I find in particular, that's a setting where I've had the most challenge in terms of asking faculty to perhaps soundbite information or lead a small group discussion rather than standing in front of the audience and delivering a traditional lecture. I find that when I ask people to participate in technology-based platforms or activities, they're immediately tuned into something being different, or they're cognizant of the fact that they may have to change the way they typically deliver content. But I still find the greatest resistance, again, in sort of a large live meeting setting. I find it's very, very hard to get people out of a traditional lecture mindset.
So maybe Alice, part of the solution is also to look into raising awareness about why is different format more efficient, and this is evidence-based, in reaching certain objectives in terms of changing behavior in the clinical practice. So we know that the didactic lecture, 2 hours length, may not be the most efficient to change interprofessional practices or collaboration. So it's also looking at, which format, yes, may be preferred by different generations of learners, but also which format will lead to the greatest impact on changing clinical behavior.
So here's a question that just came in over Twitter, which I think is kind of interesting. So if you're finding that millennials are more willing to work and learn in teams, does that mean that younger generations are more open as well to interprofessional collaboration?
That's a great question. I don't know that I think that's a logical conclusion, and I think if we look globally, and Patrick, you may be able to speak to this too from a curriculum standpoint, there is obviously across all clinical practice the notion, and we're seeing it in CME as well, interdisciplinary education and collaboration, the importance of that, and the impact of that being executed successfully in a clinical practice setting, and the impact that has on clinical care. And there's no doubt that clinical care is advanced and health outcomes are advanced when we do have exceptional interdisciplinary collaboration. So I think it's an intuitive finding. Again, Patrick, I don't know if you have any evidence or experience, at ACP specifically that would inform this.
So thank you for the opportunity. Actually, no, I don't have any evidence, but my intuition is the same as yours. And I think the reason is that over the past several years, your training programs at the level of medical schools and residency programs have emphasized and have implemented interprofessional team care of patients. And so these young physicians that are now entering into practice, this is something that they're used to. This is the norm for them rather than the exception. And I think that there is a greater degree of acceptance of this type of activity, both in terms of delivering care and educationally, and I personally find it very exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, this goes back to how they leverage social media as well. So, this younger generation that has gone to medical school and, has colleagues all over the world that they stay closely connected to. on a regular basis. And so I would agree that, they are much more likely to be, wanting to continue that teaming and collaborative type of approach. And, you see it even, I happen to have a nephew who's a resident, and, the way that he stays connected to all of the people that he's met through, his medical school and his, different research programs and things that he's been involved in is amazing. So I really think that, that trend is going to continue even as we look at the next generation from the millennials, the Gen Z. I think that trend is really going to continue, and it's something that's important to consider, as part of, the programs.
So, go ahead, Sophie.
I was just going to say, let's not forget that also there's now requirements from the College of Physicians in terms of competency. So the new generation, they have been educated and raised in those models, competency models in terms of continuing medical education, when the older generation were not familiar with that initially when they entered the practice.
Yeah, Sophie, that's an excellent point in terms of competency-based education being an expectation, particularly at the level of the LCGME and the ACGME. What I'd like to do is just take a second to talk about social media and make an observation. It's mentioned a lot in this conference, but recently I had an opportunity to speak to a number of editors of medical journals that reflect 4 or 5 of the top medical journals in the United States. All of them have a social media presence, including the Annals of Internal Medicine. Yet, to a person, no one saw yet the benefit of the social media to their journal. In other words, it didn't appear to be driving more readers to special content or activities or other applications that they wish to highlight. The editors said, we don't know what it's doing for us, but we're afraid not to have it, which I felt was an interesting observation. Now, obviously, it could be that none of them know how to use social media properly, and it's a learning process. But at this point in time, for these small group of people, they have yet to recognize the benefit of social media as it pertained to a medical journal.
That's very, very interesting. Kim, how do you, on the subject of social media, on a related front, so maybe just to approach what Patrick is saying a little bit differently, how do you advise clients? When people come to you, and I'm assuming they do, and say, we want to develop a social media strategy, what kinds of things do you tell them in this respect? Is it, as Patrick's saying, you got to do it because you're remiss if you're not there? Or is this something that people can really use tactically to their advantage?
Yeah, I think that, you really have to evaluate what you're trying to accomplish, what your objectives are. I think that sometimes we can overuse social media when it's not necessary. So, in the situation that Patrick's talking about, it may be just that, social media isn't benefiting. It sounds like social media obviously isn't benefiting that. And, maybe that's just, a lot of times we just assume that we need to use it or take it to the social media platform when we don't. So when we're working with clients, who say they want to leverage social media, we really help them be very specific around, what they're trying to accomplish, and is social media really the right platform for what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's really an excellent point. Thanks for bringing that up.
And I think, too, to delve a little further into that, Kim, and correct me if you have different perspectives on that, but, we tend to say social media as a conglomerate, but all social media is not the same, right? They're so specifically, what are the channels, the social media channels that are most effective at engaging physicians and other healthcare professionals, and are there trends there that would affect the way we're selecting or deciding to use particular social media outlets?
Yeah, and I can't talk specifically to that, but I think that, I mean, that's part of the evaluation that you have to do, is to really look at, again, like, what are your objectives? What are the various social media channels that those audiences that you're trying to touch are using? And then, does that make sense for your business and, what you want to accomplish? But maybe somebody else can talk more specifically about channels that they find, physicians are leveraging and are most beneficial.
Sure, and if anyone in the audience has specific experience too, feel free to send a comment or send some perspective our way. Be interested to see how other people are approaching this in their settings.
Let me throw a quick question in here to get kind of you guys are talking a lot about the impact of generational differences in CME, and I know that I was in a presentation at the Alliance by Carol Havens at Kaiser, I guess about 2 or 3 years ago, and she was speaking about how the current graduates of medical schools are now, the majority of them are female, and how the incoming crop of female physicians have different priorities in their lives than perhaps the male physicians who made up the majority of medical school graduates of 25 years ago did. Mm-hmm. They want to spend more time at home. They want to spend more time with their families, things like that. So how might some of the shifting gender differences among populations of today's physicians impact the future of CME?
Yeah, this is something we've looked at, and I really appreciate that perspective, Scott. I would say that globally, in some of the work that I've done at CCO and at other companies, this is something that we're seeing that's not necessarily gender specific. I think in fact it is a characteristic of millennial physicians. We're seeing people less likely to devote 150% of their life to work, mm-hmm. and that there is pressure all around from clinicians, from newer generations of clinicians, to have more options, more flexibility, more diversity in their practice and their work setting. So I would, not to negate your question, but I think we could even take it a step back and address this even more broadly. And I wonder if those trends aren't necessarily not gender specific, but just are another characteristic of the way we're seeing generational shifts in terms of what people want out of their career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think it's a generational. I don't think it's necessarily gender, because I think, some of the male physicians would say they're looking for the same types of things in terms of flexibility and balance, and that those things are important, regardless of gender for this generation. And many organizations, companies, hospital organizations are really trying to figure this out and how they're able to accommodate those demands. Where unlike the older generations that we're willing to work and be available or 24/7. How do they accommodate that? I actually sit on the board of a hospital and was talking to another board member who runs a family practice, and he was talking about the challenge of, he's ready to retire and is looking to, for who in the practice is going to take over the business of the practice. And they're really struggling with a lot of the younger generations just aren't, as interested in having both of those responsibilities in terms of, being a practicing physician in the practice, but also running the business of the practice, because they feel like they're just not, it just doesn't work for them from a work-family standpoint. So it's raising a lot of interesting issues and challenges.
Mm-hmm. To support what Kim is saying, what we've seen at HacksDev is maybe there's a blending. So there's the generational issues we've been discussing, and on top of that, there's the gender issues. So you have a subgroup of female younger physicians who have their own demand, and they're not different from what's going on in the younger generation of businesswomen who are also looking to combine, the life-work balance. They are not willing to wait too long to get their children, so they want to be able to raise their family as well as working, and they are looking for strategies or solutions in order to be able to keep on the good work in this, framework where they want that balance, which leads to interest for those younger women for, those kinds of asynchronous type of learning where they can jump in and listen to maybe a podcast for 30 minutes and do it in breaks when they have time to do so. So I think there's that blending between the generation plus the gender that gets created.
So, Elise, I agree with Sophie and Kim, and I wonder if this new generation, if this explains why they don't attend meetings, for example, and they prefer educational opportunities that are very short, specific, concise. In my generation of physicians, it's sort of like we segmented out our educational opportunities. I'm going to attend a CME meeting for 3 days. I'm going to go to grand rounds for 1 hour. It seems to me that the younger generation are looking for educational opportunities where they can fit it in between patients, for example, or listening to something on the way home, or while preparing dinner, either the mom or the dad. And we're beginning to understand that and try to create options that fit into this particular lifestyle.
That's a great point. Thank you, Doctor. To piggyback on this, and one thing I'd like to just hear from you about and pose to the audience is really to what extent you feel some of these, what we're characterizing as generational trends, are persistent or will persist over time. So is social media here to stay, or social media, for lack of a better word, a fad? When we see, and Sophie, when you described the AXDEV study around formats of preference for younger physicians and their preference for peer-to-peer mentoring and interactivity in small group, is this simply a product of their being young, they're being new to practice, they're whether it's real or it's their confidence or their perception, they're perhaps less competent. They have more to learn. And as these physicians age, can we expect to see them actually moving into a more preference for asynchronous activities or non-small group settings? So are these generational trends that we're all noting, again, persistent over time, or are they trends, fads that we might expect to go away? I'm interested to hear your perspectives on that.
I think this is a really good point you're bringing, Alice, that yes, the younger generation, they're simply also less experienced, so they're looking for formats such as mentoring and so on. But your question about is this here to stay, I think that we're making a lot of generalities trying to understand also where are those differences coming from. But there's been an evolution in the culture of medicine, and Patrick was referring to that earlier, and medical schools even now are trying to redefine the way that healthcare professionals should be trained and how they should interact in the population in order to really answer to the populational needs. So initiatives such as the Global Consensus for Social Accountability of Medical Schools, where all around the world, medical schools are asking themselves, okay, how can we rethink our curriculum? That means that this is, I will say, in French, we say vague de fond, which means there's really, it's not more than a trend, it's really something that's solid, that will impact the way healthcare will be in the future.
So we can say with resounding certainty that we think some of these generational shifts and some of the impact that we propose that these shifts should have on our design and implementation of activities would best serve us to really design and deliver impactful activities going forward. These are here to stay. As one of our participants alluded to in a question, we do need to be mindful of some of these changes. These represent global seismic changes in the composition of our physicians and our healthcare professionals, and these are absolutely things that we need to be addressing, perhaps slowly and perhaps in baby steps over time, as we design and implement impactful educational activities.
So here's another question that came in on the MedPage Today text line. I know we've just got a couple minutes left, so I want to address this one. So someone asked, are there any reports or studies we can reference when trying to select the best format for different generation types? And they might have missed the beginning of this presentation where Elise talked about a white paper from CCO. But maybe Elise or some of the others, you guys maybe in the course of your research can talk to some of the other references or resources that you were able to find on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would absolutely encourage that participant to download our white paper. We address the topic of format, activity format, and specifically length, as well as delivery in that white paper in a much more nuanced fashion that I could speak to at the start of this presentation. So you can download that from the CME Palooza homepage or the CCO website, or email me, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of that. But there is some information and some findings specific to your question in our white paper. Sophie, are the studies that you spoke about that ACSTEP produced publicly available?
Yes, well, the 2010 study is definitely already published. The other findings I was reporting are not yet published. We're working on that. So maybe there could be a way to share that reference after the meeting. I could look at it with Scott.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Kim, Patrick, any other recommendations? Resources?
No, Elise, I can't offer anything other than what's been spoken to you by you and Sophie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would add that there will be presentations at the Alliance meeting in January next year on this topic, and I think it's something that, I mentioned Kim keynoted at the CBI conference, which was held in Philadelphia last week. This seems to be a topic that's appearing more and more frequently within our community on the agendas of meetings and events that we have planned for the community. So I think we can expect that to continue and encourage all of us to utilize those forums as a way of advancing this discussion and hearing what different members of our community are doing and doing effectively in this respect.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for your time and your participation in today's panel. I think that you covered a lot of interesting topics. I know that in an hour, it's hard to think that we can only scratch the surface for some of these, but truly, this is a topic that will continue to evolve, and there will continue to be lots of discussion around it. So for those of you who are watching this session live, or for those of you who are watching it afterwards, if you could please take a look at the live tab of the CME Palooza website. There is a brief survey which will give us some information on who's watching CME Palooza, what sessions you're watching, help us with some feedback for the future. We would certainly really encourage everyone to go on and complete that short survey. And for those of you who are viewing this session live, you will need to refresh your browser once we are done here, and our next session will begin here in about 6 minutes at the top of the hour. So with that, I'd like to thank Alice and Kim and Patrick and Sophie for their participation, and we will hopefully see everyone again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.